Well, hey, everybody. Um, Welcome back. This has been one of my favorite rhythms, I think, of all of this pandemic hysteria. Has been kind of having conversation every Thursday morning, talking through how churches are leading through this. And so, thanks for coming back, being part of this. This week, I'm really kind of excited because I think we're going to be talking about something that everybody's wrestling through right now. And that's how do we reopen our church in a wise way. And so today, just an honor to be joined by Greg Atkinson and Tim Cool and Tim Nations, and then Todd's here as well. And so I think it's going to be a great conversation. So let me introduce our guests, and we can talk through some housekeeping stuff, and then I'll shut up and we can just start, talking about what we all get gathered here today to discuss. And so first up, Greg Atkinson. Greg is the founder of Worship Impressions and the First Impressions Conference. So he's an author, leadership coach, consultant. He is the go-to guy when it comes to how to make people feel welcome in your church as they're coming in, and kind of coach you up on how to make that first impressions experience a great one, so that people actually want to come back. So, Greg, thanks for taking the time to be here this morning.
Yeah, it's good to chat with you again. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, man. So, Tim Cool is joining us from Charlotte. Tim's an author, is founder of Smart Church Solutions, and he's walked with about 1,000 churches, helping them think through their facility needs. Churches do needs analysis for their buildings, master planning, construction management, all sorts of life cycle and facility management. And he created eSpace, which is a software product that helps churches manage their facilities. But he's also put together just a ton of great resources to help churches think through what it looks like to reopen facilities right now. So Tim, thanks for jumping on, man.
My pleasure. Good to be here, Matt.
Yeah. So also with us, back by popular demand, is Tim Nations. Tim is one of our church coaches, and he also leads our virtual strategy labs. But before that, before he joined ministry, Tim served as one of the directors at Leadership Network for about 12 years, and served in ministry in North Texas for about 15 years before that. So, Tim, thanks for jumping back in.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Todd told me I had to be here, but I'm glad to be here.
Well, I'm glad to hear that you're listening. So that's good. So, and last but not least, my co-founder, partner in crime, Todd Rhodes. Hey, Todd.
Hey, man. Good to be here.
So couple things, just so everybody knows, hey, we are recording this. So we will send out the link, and we will send out any download or links that are mentioned during the call today. We'll send that out probably tomorrow morning. Other than that, feel free to ask questions. Drop them either in the chat window or drop them into the question and answer box. Either way, we'll do our best to be able to answer or speak to those. So with that, let's kind of get going. We are a lot of states are somewhere in the process of reopening. They either, they may not have done it yet, but they're at least talking about what that looks like. And so churches and pastors are being kept up at night trying to figure out what that looks like for them. So, fellas, let's just ask the question. What is it that churches need to be thinking about before they reopen their building? And maybe we can start with you, Tim, and then Greg, you can kind of speak to it as well. So, Tim, what do churches need to be thinking about?
Well, I'm going to assume that you mean Tim C, not Tim N, just for clarity here.
Yeah. Well, I was hoping you guys would fight that out, but go ahead, Tim Cole.
I'm going to go ahead and just mute.
Tim.
I'm going to mute Tim Nation so that no one can hear him. There's several things that churches have got to do if they're thinking of reopening. And the very first one is going to sound totally incongruent with what most churches think about, is you have to have a cleaning protocol in place. If you don't have a plan for how you're going to clean, re-clean, and sanitize your building, you have no right to reopen. As Greg, I'm sure will jump in here, people moving back into the building are going to be hypersensitive. Think about that hunting lodge that's been closed up for several months, and you open up the doors. What's the first thing that hits you in the face? It's the smell, right off the bat. The other thing, and Greg, I'd love to get your input on this, is our buildings generally, you know, we're trying to do that first impressions for that first time guest. But in many cases, even our regular congregation is going to be a first time guest back into the building in this next new normal, whatever we want to call it, because they haven't been in our building for weeks or months. And they're going to have a whole new set of fresh eyes as they walk in. They're going to look at things as the way they clean at home versus what you've cleaned in the building, and so on and so forth. So, Greg, I'd really be interested to kind of get your take on what you think that's going to do to people as they come back in.
Yeah, you nailed it. When I come into a church as a secret shopper, the only thing I have going for me, it's not that I'm smarter than the pastor that brings me in, it's that I have fresh eyes. And so when you have it met together physically for 2 months and your congregation comes back 2, 3, 4, 5 months down the road, they're all going to have fresh eyes. They're going to have new eyes, and they're going to be secret shopping your building, whether they realize it or not. And like you said, they are going to compare it to how much do they clean at home, how much do they sanitize, how much do they disinfect, what do they take seriously, what precautions do they take. And so they're coming in, they will notice, you only have to be away from your church maybe a month to get it, but now after 2 months, they do notice the smell. They'll notice the smell right when they walk in. And so I've been encouraging people. I wrote a blog post on my blog, gregatkinson.com, about the old school congregational survey, about surveying your people before you meet together to find out if they're ready to meet, if they're ready to come back. And I shared a lot of resources, and I linked to Tim's checklist, which is a lot like a secret shopper checklist, but things to look through. And so if you haven't downloaded Tim Cool's facility checklist, and they have a new checklist, it's very, very helpful. And I saw people loving it, talking about it in my Facebook group, but there are a lot of things to think through. But I would start with just, a free Survey Monkey survey and send it out to your congregation and say, hey, if we were to open up services, would you even come back? If you volunteer, are you planning to still volunteer? Would you put your kids in children's ministry? Just thinking through all of these scenarios that we're going to have to deal with.
Yeah, absolutely. What you talk about smell. Let me throw out one of this is a really simple facility hack, but something that most people don't realize is, have you ever walked into a public restroom? And I'm going to try to be politically correct here, Todd. So if I say something wrong, you can kick me under the table here. But you walk into that restroom and it smells like someone's been there before you, but no one has been. Well, 9 times out of 10, that's not a human waste issue. That is a pee trap that's dried out issue. So your floor drains have a pee trap, which are supposed to hold water, which keeps sewer gas from coming back up into the building. Well, if your building's been sitting empty for 2 months, and for some churches, by the time they move back in, it could be 3, 4, 5, 6 months, those pee traps have dried out because you're not mopping the floors with water. And so there's not water naturally just draining down into them. So at the very least, before you open your building, take a cup of water and walk around every restroom and pour a cup of water in every one of your pee traps.
Interesting. I never thought of that, but.
Yeah. So what are some of those other things that people aren't thinking about? Because I mean, that is like Todd said, that's one of those things that you just don't think about, So I think we've had a conversation before where, you mentioned that, but I mean, what are some of those other things that we just, are blind to because we're not doing that regularly? You know what I'm asking?
Yeah. The biggest one that is going to be a shock to everyone, in my opinion, is what your worship center capacity is going to be with proper social distancing. Mm-hmm. Most of us probably attend churches that don't have pews. But for those who do, I mean, imagine trying to rope off in quarantine areas with pews. Chairs are a little different. But right here in Charlotte, Myers Park Presbyterian Church, their facility manager and I were talking yesterday, and they have a sanctuary that seats about 600 people, more or less. And they did a staggered pattern for their pews as to where they're going to let people sit. And at most, they can seat 170 people at a time. So your occupancy is going to go way down. To Greg's point with the survey, you're going to have some people that aren't going to want to come back regardless for a period of time. And so your potential occupancy is going to go down, but your real occupancy is going way down, which means you may need to consider, do you do multiple services? Do you do a Saturday night, Sunday morning, Sunday night, all repeats? Do you do multiple on a Sunday morning? The other option is, could you do multiple venues in your own campus? If you have a fellowship hall or a gym and a sanctuary, think about how can you simulcast each one of those locations and have limited occupancy in each one.
Yeah, there's so much along those lines that I've been encouraging pastors to think through webinars like this and writing and just Zoom calls with some pastors. But there's some guidelines depending on your state and local governments that's 25% capacity or no more than 25 people or no more than 50 people. And so like Tim is saying, you're going to have multiple services. Not only that, let's say you had a 9:30 service and an 11 o'clock service. Well, now you're going to need to do 9 and 11 or 9:30 and 11:30 to have enough time to clean in between services. You're going to have to space out your service times to clean and disinfect and sanitize in between each and every service. So you're not only doing more services, but you're spreading them out further because you have to clean in between each and every one. And I mentioned this in my Facebook group, and there were some churches, some well-known churches that opened up this past weekend, and they had some pictures of their parking team and greeters standing outside waving at people and holding signs, and they had masks on. And I said, here's a look at what your future holds, what it'll look like down the road. And somebody commented and said, if I have to wear a mask, then I don't want to go. I don't want to go back, or I don't want to reopen. And I said, well, then you're not ready to reopen, because we do staff, volunteers, people. That's one of the questions I asked about in the survey when I suggested a congregational survey, is to ask your people, are you expecting us as the church to provide you with a mask? Not only do you want our staff and volunteers wearing masks, but do you want us to give you one as you walk up? Like, do we need to go out and buy stock and masks and different things? But your service times are going to have to be further apart to take into account. And then that means you have new volunteer positions. You have things that you are doing on a Sunday that you've never done before. So who is the team that comes behind each service and wipes off every surface and cleans every chair and pew? And like Tim said, when you have some of these modern facilities and maybe they have plastic chairs, that's one thing. But how do you clean a wooden pew? How do you clean a chair with fabric? How do you do that in a safe way? And so there's just a ton to think through.
And that doesn't include at all. We're just talking big room, but that doesn't include add all the new considerations for cleaning children's ministry areas and new protocols for, can you share crayons, or do they have to be, all those kind of things are just brand new questions that we've never had to ask.
I'd love to hear from Tim, the more attractive Tim with the beard, on how would you coach a pastor in helping lead through the issues of people saying, well, I don't want to do it this way, and I don't want to do it that way, and how would you encourage them to lead their people through what's going to be a very awkward period of time?
Well, I think one of the things that Greg hit on is feedback and data. And, as I'm looking at plans for reopening, and I'm on some email lists for some churches, and they've shared plans for reopening, I'm a little bit surprised that there's not more feedback that's being taken in, both from staff and members, on the different attitudes and the feelings, the amount of comfort that people have. To give you a contrast, a few weeks ago, I got an email from a theater that we go to. It's one of the dine-in theaters that we frequented in the past. And they sent an email and said, hey, we're beginning to think about when to reopen again, even though they were already given the all clear in Texas, a week or so ago. they're waiting. And one of the things they wanted to do is they wanted my input, my feedback on, what was I comfortable with? What would be an encouragement for me to come back, and what would be things that would discourage me from coming back? And, as just a patron, I found that to be, I felt like my opinion mattered and valued. And I don't know how much churches and church leaders are taking the time to take the pulse of their church, to take the pulse of their staff, and to really understand how people are feeling about coming back. So, I would say, one, you have to understand where people are before you can lead them somewhere else, right? And so feedback is a great way to do that. And understanding your people better than ever is something that I think needs to be a priority of the leaders. And then if they have a real clear why behind what it is that they're trying to accomplish with reopening, regardless of what the timeline is, you can lead people toward why more than you can how, right? I mean, if you go back to Simon Sinek's famous TED talk, people who believe what you believe, those are the people that will follow you, that will buy from you, et cetera, et cetera. And so I feel like having really good feedback from the people that you're leading and serving, and having a real clear why on what you're trying to accomplish, that's a good starting point. And then creating a path to bring those two things together. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's good.
And touch on something that Todd said. I haven't heard of a single church that is doing children's ministry. Everybody I know of that is even thinking about reopening, re-entry, coming back to gather together, from the scattered church to the gathered church, coming back together, is doing some kind of family service. Because how do you get first graders to social distance? How do you get them to not run and hug and grab each other and play with each other? And how do you put them into an environment not only where they're surrounded by kids in close proximity, but their teachers are as well, and just the nightmare that would be. So I haven't heard of anybody doing children's ministry. I did a children's podcast this past week with Tom Bump, and then I watched a children's panel with William Vanderbloemen, and I didn't see anybody that was doing children's ministry. But I watched a YouTube video from Larry Osborne, and we all love and respect Larry Osborne, about 3 things to consider and 3 reasons not to meet back together. And one of them was children's ministry. Is it really realistic to sit in a family service and to have your lead pastor preach to your 5-year-old kid who's sitting there antsy in the service, moving around, he's used to graded kids curriculum that is geared to a child's mind, as opposed to sitting in a service where, by the way, most articles I read say that you can't even sing, you can't even do congregational singing. So we're going to gather back together just to hear a sermon and try to keep our kids still and not move. And so what Larry Osborne said was, if your online experience is better than what it would be like to get back together physically, stick with online for a season. If we can do it better online than to have a really weird in-person experience, he said, just stick with the online for a season and let's do it right when we can do it. So if you haven't seen that video from Larry Osborne, he's just a wealth of wisdom, really good points that he brought out.
I'm sorry, Matt, on the kids things, one of the things we're telling churches, because they're always like, well, when can we open the kids ministry back? And to Greg's point, I don't know anybody that's doing it yet, but and I don't know that's been legislated at this point in time. But here's a belief I have is, number one, the church as a whole is always under the scrutiny of our community. Things we say in the press, things that we do in public, the way we take care of our building, you name it, we're under scrutiny constantly. And during times of crisis, I find that we are under even more scrutiny, and the world is going to watch us as we reopen. They're going to judge us for how we reopen. And so if you're even considering even slightly to have a kids ministry of any sort, even if it's just baby ministry, and that's all you do is say infants, make sure you are staying in line with what your local municipality is doing. If your local municipality isn't opening up daycare to the general public, you sure shouldn't be opening up your church for any kind of child care, because now it looks like you're just thumbing your nose at the local municipalities, and it's going to speak badly about the church.
That's a huge point, right? I think there's been a lot of politicization of this whole thing, and I don't want to get into the politics on any of this kind of thing, because I think that just, I just don't want to. I'm tired of reading that on Facebook. But I think you're picking up something that's pretty wise. If the companies that do this and the businesses that do this aren't opening up for kids and all that kind of stuff, man, tap the brakes. Because the last thing I want is for a local church to be the next point where something flares up. I think that hurts our witness as a whole. And so I'd love to, I'd love for us to be able to avoid that. But I wonder, how do you communicate that well to your congregation? I don't know if that's a question for you, Tim Nations, or Greg, or who, but I mean, how do you communicate that thought process that Tim was just sharing with your church in a way that, they may not necessarily fully agree with it, but they're gonna get it. Does that make sense?
Yeah. One thing I saw a friend of mine, Sean Lovejoy, say recently was to plan and prepare internally and communicate externally. And so we have to meet with our leadership. We have to meet with our volunteers. I would not even dream. I lead a large Facebook group, so I've got a pretty good pulse on what's happening around the nation, and I can see churches jumping back in so quickly, and it really concerns me, because there are so many meetings and plannings and trainings that you would have to do it properly. And so if you're not meeting with your leadership and you're not meeting with your volunteers, your ushers, your parking team, and saying, who's going to stand here? Nobody should touch any door. Nobody should touch any surface. Who's gonna come behind people and wipe a handle off if somebody accidentally touched the door? Who's going to clean in between services? How are we going to do, like I mentioned, our service times? How are we going to space them out so we have time to clean? And so start with the survey, and then do lots of, it could be Zoom like this or in person if you're ready to meet back in person, but you need to be meeting with your leadership, with your elders, with your staff, but you also need to meet with your volunteers. And I say this, I was on a webinar yesterday, and I was saying, these are the same people, and you got to understand, from a first impressions guy like me that trains ushers and greeters and parking team, these are the same people that we have tried to get to do stuff for years. So when I go into a church and the pastor tells me, yeah, I don't know why the parking team is always bunched up talking to each other and ignoring the cars, and I've asked them to spread out across the lot, but they like to bunch up together. And I don't know why the ushers don't seat people. They just stand there and hand out bulletins, but they don't actually seat people. By the way, ushers are going to have to seat people now. We're going to have to rope off our auditoriums. And then you got the greeter that goes rogue, who's a rebel that doesn't wear the greeter t-shirt. So you have all these greeting team and t-shirts that say welcome or hello or I can help. And then you have the one person that wears a shirt and tie and refuses to wear the team t-shirt. These are the people that we're going to try to pull off this next level sanitation with, the people that have fought you every week for years. You have got to have some leadership and training meetings to say, okay, guys, is everybody on board? We can't have you refuse to wear a mask. Everybody's going to wear a mask. We can't have you not take seriously the 6 foot. We can't have you not take seriously, don't stick your hand out and shake people's hands. We can't have you getting in people's space. And so the same people, the same parking team that's bunched up in the lot, not in their correct positions, the same road greeter that's not wearing the t-shirt. This is people. Ministry is people. And we deal with some bullheaded people. We deal with some unique people in ministry and church contexts as pastors and church leaders. And so you have to go to that same team of people that may have bucked your every decision along the years and tell them, here's our process. Like Tim started out, here's our new clean protocols. Here's what we're going to do to keep people safe and healthy. Are you on board with this? And so there's so much prep work that has to be done. I see people that say we're opening up this Sunday, and I think there's no way you've had all these meetings and all this training. It really, really concerns me.
Yeah, well, oh, go ahead, Tim.
I was just going to say on the communication side, this is the time to over communicate and to drive your people crazy with communication, because a lot of what we're doing here, especially churches that are opening earlier, is, you're setting expectations for people. And I would go back to something I said earlier. I said, I think where you want to start is you want to start with a good understanding of where your people are, what their concerns are, what their fears are, and then figure out how to communicate to those different groups of people and the things that are important to them. Blanket communications for everyone are not effective, and they're not going to work. If you look at some of the data, Barna and Glue have put out the Church Pulse survey, and a lot of churches are using that to get a feel for, where their church members are. And on the ones that I've seen, on average, it's about 13% of people in a congregation will come back as soon as the doors are open. That's only 13%. There's about 45, 50%, I think, last time I looked, that will come back, but only when there are, measures in place that they feel comfortable about. And so, you've got to think about where all your people are and what their different perceptions, what their different expectations are, and make sure that you're communicating and over communicating to each one of those. To give you an example, going back to some of the churches that I've been on their list and I'm getting their reopening plans, I've gotten one email from a couple of them, and that's it. Here's our plan. Here's what we're going to do. And if I'm someone with little kids, I need to know what that means for me. If I'm an older adult, I need to know what that means for me. If I'm somebody that is, compromised in some way physically, I need to know what that means for me and how that experience is going to be different for me. And so I think like these guys are saying, Greg and Tim are saying, there's a lot of work on the front end that needs to be done, not only with the logistics of it, but the communication of it, so that people, when they walk onto that campus for the first time, they know exactly what to expect. They know exactly where to go. They know exactly what the experience is going to be like. And that's going to be the best way to make it a win for all the people that are involved in your church.
I think that's absolutely right. And I want to go back just really quickly, going back off what you said, Tim, nations, but also something that Matt said, is that we don't want to get into the politics of all of this, but as church leaders and pastors, the politics are entering into this in ways that we've not seen before. Some of the conversations I've had with pastors just in the past week as they're trying to negotiate and navigate this reopening plan is there's a tremendous amount of pressure. Pastors always want to please people, right? But there's a tremendous amount of pressure on all sides of that spectrum. And I talked to a pastor the other day that said, look, I've got 20% of my congregation that openly thinks this whole thing is a hoax. And they're like, why did we ever stop meeting, right? And some of the, I talked to a pastor recently that said, I got a long letter from an attorney, a really smart attorney that's been in my church forever, that's just like, why did we ever stop meeting? And then you've got other people that attend my church or that used to attend my church that are saying, I don't want to come back until there's a vaccine. So there's pressure on pastors and leadership teams on both sides. And then you've got all these people in the middle that they're trying to figure this out. I'm going to throw this to the Cool Tim. Cool Tim, how, I'm sure you're hearing the same thing from pastors. How are they negotiating? Negotiating is not the right word. How are they navigating the tremendous pressure they have from people on the polarized side of everything, and how are they trying to mitigate the polar ends?
Yeah, I'm going to speak politically incorrect for a minute. And the first thing is pastors and their church leaders need to grow a pair. Okay, just to be blunt, and they need to do what is right for their church. So where I live here in Charlotte, we've got a Harris Teeter, a Publix, and a Fresh Market, all supermarkets that for some unknown reason, my wife uses all three of them to get our groceries. Well, the Fresh Market has signs out now, please do not come in unless you've got a face covering. They made a choice as a business to require face masks. So then my choice as the consumer is I can either put on a face mask and shop there, or I can choose not to. And so churches have got to be firm enough to not be just people pleasers, but realize that this is a much broader issue. There's impact, as I said earlier about KidsMin. This is going to impact how people look at us in the future. This is going to potentially impact people that are members of our church that are going to be offended and decide to go somewhere else. This could impact people that could be a first-time guest that are like, oh, if that's the way they do it, I don't want to be part of their church. And so come up with what's the right plan for your church and hold to it. And communicate to your people. We realize some of you may disagree with the choice we've made. And we love you still. If you can join us online, if you can join us here or there, whatever it is, give them those other options, Todd. But you need, I mean, I talked to a pastor the other day up near you in Wapakoneta. And he's the children's pastor. He goes, man, I'm working harder than I've ever worked. He goes, getting these kids ministry things for Sunday is really hard compared to just showing up and running my mouth for an hour. And so for a lot of church staff, they're working harder than they've ever worked. And so putting together that cleaning protocol or your first impressions protocol or your greeters protocol and all those things are going to take time and effort and intentionality. But once you've got it set, let that be the way it is and don't have exceptions.
Well,
yeah,
go ahead, Greg.
I would piggyback off that because I totally agree. I think one, we as pastors and church leaders are shepherds. We are called to steward those that God has entrusted into our care. So we have to take their safety and health very seriously. But two, as Tim Nations was saying, to over communicate. And one way that we communicate, and this is what I look for as a secret shopper when I go to churches and I visit, if you were to look at one of my reports, you will see that I evaluate all signage, all communications, all wayfinding signage. Churches, the reason I say you can't just say we're going to open up this week that you're not ready yet is there are new signs that you're going to need in today's post-COVID coronavirus world that you didn't need before. I have a weekend worship and guest services Facebook group, and somebody posted signs they had just created for their church in the Dallas metro area yesterday. And they had things like stand here, or like for people that are waiting in line, this many feet apart and little feet of where you stand on the ground. They had a sign that said to download the church app, because everything was going to be communicated through the app. There's no handouts, no bulletins, no printouts, no print pieces. Everything I read is saying, do not do bulletins, do not pass the plate, do not pass communion, do not touch anything. So they're trying to do, like Craig Rochelle called it, a touchless experience. And so this church in the Dallas metro area had a sign that said to be sure to download the app, because everything, digital connection card, bulletin, every announcements, everything was going to be communicated through the app. And so, I'm very similar. We have grocery stores here. I live very close to Tim Cool in the Charlotte metro area. And we have grocery stores where there's one way in and one way out. They have totally closed off. If I walk up to a grocery store front that has a left and a right entrance, the left entrance, it says exit only, and the right entrance says enter. And then they have markings every 6 feet where people stand, and they only let so many people in the store at once. And in my Facebook group, we were talking about things that people need. So like, you're going to have to create signage that you've never had before. You also are going to somehow have to hit the lottery and find hand sanitizer and disinfectant and face masks. I know Outreach and several other large Christian companies are trying to help churches purchase these and acquire these, but they're not shipping until June or July. And so somebody shared a link to face mask and hand sanitizer at Outreach and other companies, and they were complaining that it wasn't going to be available to ship until July. And I said, well, maybe you should think about not meeting until July. Like, we have supplies we don't even have access to yet. And so you're going to have to think through the experience. If you're going to tell people to sit here and not sit here, then you're going to have to create signage. And so if you don't have all these signs in place and communication pieces and everything digital, no handout, no printout, a touchless experience, you're going to have to pump the brakes and just really be methodical and strategic in how you re-enter back into the physical space.
Yeah, when you think about the touchless experience, we've got to remember, while I attend a church that is definitely more on the millennial contemporary side, a lot of the people that are on this and a lot of churches in America are still hymn book and tithe envelope and visitor card, because they still think they're not guests. They think they're visitors, so they have a visitor card. You need to remove all of that stuff. If you have pews and you have back seat material, you need to get rid of it. You go hide it somewhere. Don't let anybody touch it. If you're part of, any of the faith traditions that do communion on a regular basis, the common goblet is gone for a while and maybe gone forever. The idea of the all-in-one communion, the juice and wafer in a single pack is going to be a more necessary way to go. And you don't want people passing them out. So maybe have them in a bucket as people are coming in the building, and then tell people don't put them in the pew back or the seat back. Get some extra trash receptacles as people are leaving and ask them to dispose of them for you. All these things are going to require everybody to do something that's going to not feel normal.
Yeah, I would echo with that. There are companies that make those prepackaged communion cups and wafers, and they're all sold out. They're all on back order. And so if you're a congregation and your denomination, you do communion every week, you're not ready. You can't even find them. You can't purchase them. You can't get them. They are all sold out. If you go on Amazon or any of these Christian companies, they say out of stock. And so we have to practice patience and use wisdom. Pray for wisdom and discernment.
Yeah, I think the other thing, just a practical tip related to that, people are going to come in again, even the people that have been there for years, and it's going to be a different experience for them. And so in addition to the signage and all of the extra steps that you're taking to make it clear for someone, it may be clear to you, but that doesn't mean it's going to be clear to everyone else who's coming in. And so, one real practical idea is to just do a video walkthrough with people before they ever come in the building and let them know what to experience, from the parking lot to coming into the doors to finding a seat to the things that are going to be different about the worship experience. You don't have to wait until people get there to try and communicate that to them and get them up to speed and feeling comfortable about what's going to happen. Try to put that out in advance. We're very visual learners, and so being able to see that before we walk in the door is going to be helpful to a lot of people. So just a practical suggestion there. The other thing, just listening to you guys talk, the other thing that I think we need to be aware of is, I've heard a lot of people talk about how this is going to be like it was after 9/11, which I think in terms of people flocking back to church, I think that's a very false expectation. That's a whole different conversation. But one of the things I heard brought up recently about that experience regarding travel was the fact that before 9/11, you probably knew nothing about the TSA. But since 9/11, everybody who travels knows who the TSA is and knows what those regulations are. In a lot of ways, coming back to church after this is going to feel like the TSA has moved into your church. There's going to be a lot of new regulations, a lot of new things in place that weren't there before that are going to change the worship experience. And so there's a psychological issue that we have to be aware of and deal with as leaders. And so make sure that what you're communicating, the way that you're communicating, is taking that into account as well.
That's good.
That's really good. Let me do this if we can. Can we play a logistics speed round for a minute? You know, pardon the cheesy name. I just a few things I just want to ask you guys, just real quick answer what you're telling your churches about some of these things, if you don't mind. You know, just kind of those logistical things. So what are you telling people as far as, you know, temperature checks at the doors? Is that required, mandatory? Is that something to avoid? Start buying them now? I mean, what are you telling your churches?
What I'm telling churches, it's an option. You just need to have an extra 2 hours before your service time to take everybody's temperature. So why would you do that? You know, that's one of those things that if you feel temperature checks is a mandate, then to Greg's point, you're probably not ready to reopen and just need to reconsider not doing it. Now, if you're going to at some point open up kids ministry and you want to take the temperature of the children coming in, that might not take as long. But then the other side of that is what happens, what do you do, and are you prepared when someone's temperature is too high and you have to turn them away?
Right.
You know, how do you deal with that? Or what happens if that kid, as any child, throws up? Are you ready with the hazmat gear to clean that up and do it in a way that, again, keep in mind, so much of this is perception.
Yep.
And so whether or not you clean it up the same way you did a year ago versus today, people are going to watch you and they're going to expect you to take more extensive protocols to get it done than they did before. And even if it cleans it the exact same way, the perception is, oh, they're taking more care to get it done.
Gotcha. Yeah, and I would say from a first impression standpoint, like it or not, when that child, for whatever reason, bless his or her heart, when they throw up, the impression that the other parents have that watch this or see the kid coughing or see the parents refusing to leave when it's been confirmed they have a temperature, the impression that does to your church, that is a black eye, that is bad PR, that is people that will not come back because you didn't ask the kid to leave when he clearly had a fever. You know, and talking about the protocols of cleaning up vomit, which is something children's ministry do. But, you know, I thought this was interesting when all this first went down. The last time I traveled was the weekend of March 7th and 8th. I went to work with a church in Baltimore. And then the next week is when most churches started shutting down, and I haven't traveled since. But I ordered hand sanitizer, and it was almost all sold out. Like you couldn't find any hand sanitizer on Amazon. But I found one kind of weird, no-name, sketchy place that I'd never heard of, and I ordered hand sanitizer from there. And here we are in mid-May, and it still has not arrived. I can go to my local grocery store, my local Walmart, my local Target. There is no Lysol, no disinfectant, no sanitizing wipes, no hand sanitizer. I've not been able to find it anywhere. And so you've got to make sure that you're stocked up and prepared for emergencies, because some kid, some toddler, some kid is going to come and he's going to have a cough, and you're going to have to wipe down surfaces. And so you just got to be prepared.
Yeah. Fortunately, parents don't bring sick kids to church, right? So we don't really have to worry about that.
Oh, you are so wise, Tim.
Yeah. So what are you telling churches about bathroom usage? I mean, emergency only, don't do it. I mean, water fountain, same thing, or just go and pretend like it's normal because we've poured water down the P-trap.
I like the comment the guy put on here that a P-trap doesn't mean that that's where people pee. So that was hilarious. So, you know, obviously you want to recommend that people avoid the public restroom if possible. I would totally close off the drinking fountains. I would just totally tape them off, close them off, turn the water off even if you have to. Restrooms, I suggest putting a hand sanitizer, if you can find hand sanitizer. And by the way, Greg, if you need some, let me know. There's a place in Florida that you can buy it by the 5 gallon. It's $200 for 5 gallons. But because it's got 70% alcohol, they can't mail it. They have to send it on a freight truck. So the freight's $250 on top of the $199. So anyway, but we've got clients that are putting hand sanitizers on the outside of the door as well as the inside of the door. And then Greg, are you a Delta guy or an American guy?
American, you know, I'm based out of Charlotte like you.
Yeah, but I'm a Delta guy. I know, call me twisted. It's the easiest way to build up miles because everything's a double legger.
Right.
But if you ever go to a Delta Sky Club every one of their bathroom doors on the back of it have a foot opener. It's a little thing at the bottom that you can grab your foot and open it. And I'm going out this afternoon to one of our clients here, Forest Hills Church. They put it in all of their bathrooms. They're only $24. So it's not a real expensive item, but it allows you to have a relatively touch-free experience. If you don't have touch-free hand drying, you at least need that. So whether that's air or the automatic paper dispensers. You may have to consider if you're a large church with a lot of stalls, you may need to consider closing off every other stall.
I was on a webinar yesterday with Generis and some other first impressions friends of mine, Danny Franks from Summit Church in Raleigh-Durham with J.D. Greer, and Jason Young, who was on staff at North Point with Andy Stanley. And Jason mentioned the foot open of the door as well. And he also said, why not have a trash can right next to the door of the bathroom so that you can use a paper towel to grab the handle, open the door, and then drop it in the trash so that you can try to, you don't want to touch the door and then walk back out into public. So he said, put a trash can right by the door so you can use a paper towel to open it and then throw your trash away. But restrooms are going to be sticky. It's going to be tricky.
Was that a pun that they're going to be sticky or?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Nice.
Hey, Matt, I will say one thing. You need to work on your speed round facilitation skills. Kind of lost that early, but something I want to bring up that's totally off topic. Since we lost the speed round, we can get back to it. But one of the things I think it's important, I think we've danced around this, but we haven't really said it. In the midst of all of our communication, we're focusing primarily on what to communicate about coming back, but we need to be sure that we are communicating that not coming back is just as faithful a response for people as coming back to the building. One of my fears is that we're making this all about coming back on Sunday, right? And that coming back on Sunday is the pinnacle of what faithfulness looks like. And I would just encourage leaders that as they are over communicating about what the experience is going to be like coming to the building, that they also over communicate what the ongoing other options are going to be, and that those are just as faithful a response for people as coming back and assembling in some form. And so anyway, for whatever it's worth, I wanted to throw that out there.
So how does that conversation go, Tim? What does that sound like?
Well, I think it gets back to, what's our why in what we're doing as a church. And I think you recommunicate what your mission is. And the reality is that our mission as a church should have very little to do with Sunday morning gatherings. And I'm trying to be real positive in all this stuff, but I'm afraid that so much emphasis on getting people back in the building is putting too much value on the gathering. Now, gatherings are important, but there's a lot of other ways to gather other than getting a big group together on Sunday morning. And so I think church leaders need to come back to the why of what our mission is as a church, and how each one of the options that are available to you now and in the future are a living out of that mission. I think that's a great exercise for church leaderships to go through, because one of the things they may realize is that all the stuff that we're talking about has really little to do with what our mission is as a church. And we've got a lot of things that we can do as leaders that we need to maximize that will push our mission forward farther or further, whichever it is, than just trying to get people back as soon as we can on Sundays. And so anyway, to get back to your question, Matt, I think understanding what our mission is, recommunicating that to the church and saying, here's how each one of these responses is faithful to the mission that God has given us. And people, I think people will respond to that, and people need that affirmation that if you're going to come back, if you're going to be one of the first people in the door on Sunday when we open it, then that's a faithful response to our mission as a church. If you're one of the people that's going to hang back and you're going to stay in your home, you're going to stay in your neighborhood with your community, that's a faithful response to our mission as a church and what God has called us to. And so, again, you got to get back to what the core is, what the mission is.
Yeah, I think that's vitally important. And one group of people that we haven't talked about yet that I just want to throw out here real quick, both to Tim Cool and to Greg, is we've not talked at all about the high riskers, the elderly, those that have pre-existing conditions that really should not, at least by most accounts, should not be out and about, should not be attending large gatherings. Tim, Greg, what are you hearing from pastors? What are you telling your church clients as far as when you do open? How are you going to communicate to those high risk in your church, who, by the way, a lot of churches have a lot of these high risk people that are their active volunteers, their greeters, their supporters on Sundays. So that opens up a whole different scenario. What are you guys hearing? What are you telling? Tim, you first.
Yeah. So we're going back to the idea of communicating to your congregation and making it more myopic to individual groups, as Tim mentioned, instead of just this broad kind of email, is you need to focus on that at-risk group and try to send them a message or individual phone call, do a Zoom call, go out and stand in their yard and talk to them, whatever it takes to communicate with them. But I would strongly suggest that you communicate the vision and mission of the church again, and that we are interested in their safety. And because we're taking every precaution possible at the church, it's impossible for us to know all the precautions, and we would not want to put them in harm's way. And as such, we would recommend that they would stay at home. Please join us online, and do that kind of thing. I think that is the fairest way to not just them, but to everybody in the congregation.
Yeah, I would. I'm just looking in the chat, Matt, and I see a question from Matt Moore that I think we ought to touch on. That's a really good question that churches are going to have to deal with. But on this topic, as far as the vulnerable, I have 2 kids with weak immune systems. I have children that aren't seniors. They're not in their 60s and 70s and 80s, but they have illnesses and weak immune systems, and so you have to take that into account. But I was watching somebody say that it was their older congregation that was so anxious to get back to the building. But if that's going to put them in danger, if it's going to put them in harm's way, if it's going to cause them to get sick, I don't have the link in front of me right now to put in the chat, but I can send it to Matt and Todd later, and they can share it. I'm sure some of you have seen the leaked CDC guidelines that were posted. I saw 2 70-year-old church consultants that have been consulting for 40 years post them on Facebook. The White House did not publicize them. They did not put their stamp on them, but nevertheless, they are the CDC guidelines, and they have very specific guidelines, including no one 60 or older gathering together. And I posted that in my Facebook group that said nobody 60 or older should come to the gathering. And somebody said, well, that's our pastor. That's half our leadership,
Yeah.
But that's a real thing. This is what the CDC is saying to avoid and to be sure to watch out for. And so we do, as stewards of those that God has entrusted in our care and as shepherds, we have to protect the weak and the vulnerable.
Wow, that's so important, so important. And my last question, and all of this is just so new, and I appreciate the conversation today, because I think it's going to cause a lot of churches, a lot of church leaders to really consider all the different things, and as Tim was saying, all the different protocols that need to be put in place. Somebody asked a question, Mike, I think, asked a question in the chat that I think would be a great question to kind of close on today. Again, because all of this is so new. He said, I would love to hear your thoughts on what you would do when a member of your church calls on a Wednesday and says they were at church on Sunday and now they've tested positive. We hear a lot of talk about contact tracing and, on top of social distancing and all of that. But I mean, this is inevitably going to happen, right? As churches start to open up, and I'm not sure that anybody's really thought about it. So you get that phone call, Greg, as a pastor, what do you do?
Well, here's what should have already been done, and this is where you back up, and this is why I talk about planning before you communicate. So plan internally, communicate externally. Planning internally, what churches are doing that I'm seeing that are opening up across the country in Georgia and in Texas and California. What churches are doing is they're doing a ticketing system where you have to have a ticket to come to the service. And so let's say your auditorium holds 100 people and you're going to do 25% capacity. You're going to have 25 people per service, and you're going to do 4 services of 25 people, even though your auditorium holds 100 people. Then you want to advertise on Eventbrite or your CHMS like Planning Center or something like that through your database or iTickets. You want to have maybe 20 tickets available. Don't put all of them. I was on a webinar with somebody else recently who was talking about their Christmas program, and if they had 1,000 seats available, they would only offer 800 tickets. They wanted to undersell because you're going to have people that show up without tickets. But what a lot of people are doing through this ticketing program is marking attendance of who's there. You have to go back and inform everybody that was there on that Sunday that somebody tested positive, which is what Todd is talking about. And so if you have not done that prep work, if you do not know who is in the building, and it's inevitable, it will happen, when that person calls on Wednesday and says, hey, just want you to know I tested positive, you have to go back to every single congregation member. It's your responsibility and your duty to inform everybody that was there on Sunday, somebody tested positive. We just wanted you to know because you were there in attendance. So you're going to have to track attendance. You're going to have to do tickets. A lot of protocols that have to be put into place to do this properly and responsibly.
Wow. Tim, thoughts on that? Tim, cool.
I just say close your buildings and never reopen. Okay, so that's not a great option.
We just lost everybody.
We just lost everybody. Yeah, I agree with Greg. I think there's going to have to be, you're going to have to communicate it. Again, the two things, if we could sum this whole discussion down to two comments, it's protocols and communication. And so both of those things are going to, again, for a lot of churches, the communication, yeah, we've kind of done it, but this is a little different communication. The protocols and the ways we do church during this next temporary normal period of time is going to be different. And people just need to buckle up because we're not in Kansas anymore.
Yeah, that's great. Thank Tim, Greg, thank you guys for taking some time to kind of share your wisdom on this. I know we're kind of getting up against time, so I want to respect that, but appreciate your thoughts, appreciate your wisdom. We'll be sending out, with the recording of this, we'll be sending out also the links that were mentioned on this so that you guys have access to that, as well as just information on where to find Tim and Greg and Tim. So couple of things I just want to mention real quick, if we can, before we wrap up. One, we are really excited. Next week, we're having another one of these. Next week, we'll be joined by Dave Travis and Todd Bolsinger, who's the author of Canoeing the Mountains, just talking about what it looks like for the church to change on the other side of this. How is this pandemic changing us? What do we need to rethink as a organization? And what does that look like going forward? So really looking forward to that conversation as well. If you haven't registered, it's chemistrystaffing.com/virtual. And also we're getting ready to launch our next virtual strategy lab, and Tim Nations is leading those. Tim, what are you guys going to be running through this upcoming lab?
Yeah, a couple of things we're focusing on is this conversation that we're having right now is how to open responsibly and just help churches think through, there's a lot, just from this webinar, there's a lot of information out there that you got to take in, and knowledge is important, but really coming to understand that and what that means for your church and going through a process of making decisions is really what the lab is about. That and then digital engagement, for churches that are, waiting to open, or churches that understand, hey, some things we're doing digitally, we want to figure out how to keep doing those in the future, even after we open. We really want to focus on how can churches increase digital engagement to help people grow in other ways.
That's great. So we're looking to launch that probably in the next 7 to 10 days. I think we got one slot left, maybe, Tim.
Yeah, and this next one. Mhm.
Yeah, so you can find out more about those at chemistrystaffing.com/labs, and during the midst of the pandemic, those are all tuition optional. So love to have you be a part of that. But again, thank you all for hanging out with us again this morning. Grateful for all of you guys, and seriously, Tim, Greg, Tim, thank you guys for your time this morning.
A pleasure.
Thanks for having me.